South and the global North. And I will make in my presentation a few examples of how somehow the North and the South are both joining the discourse on sustainability and on sustainable procurement. And by no means the South is lagging behind. If anything, we could say the opposite. But also confirms to many extent, and I hope I don't get any economists angry now, but I think that is also very much joins to the criticism of neoliberalism that we have seen to many extent, both in the very vocal in the economic debate, but also in procurement. So, but why procurement? One of the questions that we really need to address is why procurement? And it's procurement because procurement is a strategic vision because of the importance that procurement has in global economic terms, and also because procurement is not neutral. If we don't include sustainability criteria, we risk exacerbating certain conditions. And I hope that this will be made clearer when in my second part of my talk, I explain a bit more about gender equality and why this is so important. And, you know, the economic aspect, you've seen it and you've heard it a million times. Procurement can act as a leverage to promote certain goals because the public force is important in economic terms. It's almost 1.8 trillion from the economic perspective, but also because of political reasons, because public procurement is a business process within a political system, and so it is part of a political agenda. We're not mentioning the fact that it's taxpayer money, and so taxpayers need to have a say on how it's spent. But public procurement is a multifaceted process and it tackles multiple problems. And we must adopt a broader concept, a holistic approach to public procurement that includes equity and social issues, that includes economic and strategic issues. So, and I think this is really what is the difference between the vision and the notion of sustainable procurement that we have nowadays and what it used to be in the past, what it used to be, the simply linking procurement and other secondary or horizontal policies. But of course, there are still barriers to sustainable public procurement. And, you know, the UNEP report in 2017 lists a few of these barriers, the fact that, you know, still the perception that it's difficult to acquire goods and services that are sustainable. And you know, you can see here there is quite an extensive list of what these barriers are. And we certainly cannot ignore these barriers, because by ignoring them, it means that we just don't have effective policies. Yet at the same time, I think that these barriers should not discourage us, and we should not give up. And new trends at the international and at the EU level confirm the importance of persisting. Think just, for instance, about the EU due diligence initiative that has just been issued. We thought that public procurement authorities alone couldn't possibly change the market, but I think that the movement that has emerged, first and foremost from the procurement community, has certainly strengthened the initiatives that have been made at a more general level, at the business level, to ensure that due diligence is taken more seriously. And public procurement is an important tool to achieve policy goals, especially when we look at the SDG, within the context of the SDG. And in this respect, I think it's very clear within the context of empowering women through sustainable public procurement. And the role of gender equality in poverty reduction is the topic of extensive academic discourse, extensive economic literature has shown what are the advantages of including women within the economy, advantages from an economic point of view, but also from a social perspective. And gender equality fits within the prospect of sustainable development, most clearly seen within the Sustainable Development Goals 5 and 10 on gender equality and on reducing inequalities. And there are economic, social, political advantages for ensuring that public procurement can support gender equality. But for me, and I return to this concept that I was saying at the very beginning, the most important reason is that procurement is not gender neutral, and gender blind procurement can damage and compromise gender equality, causing harm to women and exacerbating inequalities, exacerbating women's conditions. For instance, by weakening their efforts, their economic efforts, or by diminishing their agency within society. But because I was saying, procurement can have implications on both the demand and the supply side. So when we look at procurement, and this is something that I really care very much for, and I hope it comes across throughout the presentation, that we need to look at procurement in an holistic way. We can't just see, and we can't equate procurement and gender equality with giving more procurement to women-owned business. It's not just about increasing participation of women in the market. Procurement can have implication on both the demands and the supply side. The demand side, because women are users of goods, services, works. So, for instance, if we cut procurement spending on healthcare, it's most likely that those that will be affected the most are women, because women make extensive use of healthcare. If we cut the provision of buses, we will affect women, because women tend to use buses and public transport much more than men. The supply side, again, we need to move away from a conception that procurement can help only as far as women-owned business is concerned. But we need to think about the relationship that women have in employment into companies that provide goods and services for the state. So how are the working conditions for women in companies that supply for the state? And this is especially relevant when we think about sectors that are mostly where women are mostly employed. For instance, the healthcare service, the caring services. If we externalize services where women are most employed, and if those externalization, outsourcing, means that workers' conditions deteriorate, what we end up doing is deteriorating the conditions of women who are employed by these companies. So that's why I say that we need to have a broader approach to gender equality and an holistic approach to what and how we see procurement. And in this respect, you know, it's also important to think another element, intersectionality for me is as well something very important. The condition of a white woman is very different from a migrant woman, from a black woman, from a colored woman. Social class is important. What we do if we tend to focus only on CEO or on top managers, all we do is supporting white rich women who have had the chance to break the ceiling. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. Please don't misunderstand me, but I'm saying that that is not enough. This would just be performative. I'm not happy with an approach that would just benefit 1% of women. We need to move towards the 99%. So, an empowering woman is very important. A study by the WFP has shown that there are multiple benefits in empowering women, social, economic, capacity building. So when we give strength to women at an economic level, we empower women, we give them agency in the family and in society. It's very expensive what we could say, and we could talk forever, but there is this watch here next to me that is really talking to me and stressing me out. So I need to
7 minutes. Yeah.
7 minutes that I can say a lot, but I feel lots of slides. So, but I just want to say, you know, it's important to think about all the actions that could be taken and to empower women. But for me, and this is something that we really worked hard with the World Bank and in the World Bank report, is trying to understand that supporting women through public procurement should be taken at 3 levels. Understanding the country is important. At the institutional level, it's important to consider gender equality, and then throughout the procurement cycle. Understanding the country is key, because procurement can intervene where the country is failing. And we need to identify the barriers that women face and how public procurement can help overcome those barriers. For example, there is no equal pay law, and the equal pay conditions within the contract conditions of a procurement contract. But if you don't know the country, you're not able to identify where the weaknesses are. So if you don't know the country, you don't know if women have access to bank account. You don't know if women can own funds, or if women can own land, or can own a business. So you need to understand the country, to understand where the weaknesses are and how public procurement can intervene to overcome such weaknesses. And this can also be used as a strength. In the same token, if there is a legislation on equal pay, then you can not only use the contract conditions, but you can use the qualifications criteria as well and say, well, do you breach the equality law? Then you can't at all bid for public contract. So the importance of ensuring that no one size fits all in procurement as in development more generally. Another example can be done for a women-owned business, and each country has got a different definition of what is a woman's-owned business. But at the same time, we need to make sure we avoid tokenism. So the country, the understanding the country pillar, I think, is quite clear why it is important. The institutional framework, and there I look at the procurement time today. Can you really promote gender equality if you as an institution are completely gender unaware? If you don't have training on gender equality for yourself? Or if you have a workforce that is totally and completely composed of men, I think it would be ironic to then impose gender equality conditions to suppliers when you yourself don't play by your own rules. And then finally, let's look at gender equality within the procurement cycle. And you know that the procurement cycle is complex. It's not just about the tendering process per se. It's about the planning, it's about the tendering, and then it's about the contract condition and the monitoring and the execution of those conditions. So where does gender equality fit? I don't have time to look at all the phases of the procurement process, but I think it would be good to just focus on a few of them. So if we look at the procurement cycle and we think about the very first stage, the strategy, the planning, the transparency. Planning, what you have to do is to insert gender equality at the very first stage. So to start by considering how does this procurement will affect gender equality. So again, the example I was doing to you at the very beginning, am I outsourcing a service? Who is employed in that service? Who will be most affected? Who uses that service? But at the same time, planning means looking at the market, look at who is most active in that market, what type of companies are active in that market. And from there, you can draw your strategy. So, you know, needs assessment, for instance, one example is Sweden. In the Swedish Association of Local Authorities has developed a checklist that can be used to assess the gender impact of the plan purchased. And just to give you one example of a country who is using that. Oh, sorry, here I no longer have. So budgeting as well is another, thank you. Budgeting as well is another issue that can be taken into account. In the Dominican Republic, as a result of Law 3406, the procurement director reserves a proportion of the budget with 15% to SMEs that can be increased to 20% if the companies are owned by women. And here I just wanted to give you a few examples of how both countries from the global north and the global south are taking into account gender equality. There are examples of how gender equality is taken into account from the very first stage. And then transparency, again, within the very first stage of the procurement process. Transparency and digitalization, as we all know, is very important, and using accessible technology, if the system is not ready, is a possibility to start a specific procurement procedure to then extend and cover the whole system. We need to use this digitalization to gather data, gather important data on the composition of the market. And in this respect, what we found out in our study is that it's very important not just to look at who wins procurement contracts and what's the gender data in relation to who wins the contract, but also who participates to those contracts. And knowing data on participation enables us to identify weaknesses. And then finally, we can do example really for all the procurement process. We can do example for how we look at the qualification criteria, the specification, the tendering, even the language that is used is important. And needs to be, and there are lots of other examples that I could have made, but which I will not make. No, but really, it's almost finished, and, I don't want to, you know, I don't want, of course, just very quickly, you know, that then you can have a work criteria that favor women-owned companies. You know what the obstacles could be from that point of view in countries such as the European Union. You know that this is an issue that needs to be resolved at the European level and from a legal perspective. And there are, you know, there are things that could be done that would help, such as, for instance, avoiding abnormally low tender, because in those tenders usually who risk losing the most are employees, and so on the wages. And if the company is a company that employs a lot of women, we discourage you know, we tend to exacerbate women equality. So just to say that it's important to look at all the aspects of the procurement process, and there are millions of examples that could be made. And I think that it's important to really think about those aspects and those, you know, and think of procurement and the procurement cycle altogether, rather than just thinking that we can address gender equality with tokenist measure. Because otherwise we just end up being performative, and we just end up wanting to do a tick box rather than really using a powerful tool to promote an important policy such as gender equality. And I think I can close it here, and I leave the floor for questions and to Vinay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anna Maria. Let me just very quickly stress, first of all, thank you for interpreting our title, actors, and best practices in the proper way. Also, I'm reminded as a European that is now faced with an environment of the European Recovery Plan, right? In Italy, for example, for the first time now we have introduced, say, rewards for employment that is gender conscious, quote unquote, for the first time. But at the same time, I think of the current debate in Italy, where you have the discussion as to whether or not to reach the 2% of GDP, and I'm looking at Martin, in terms of defense spending, and a lot of political parties saying, well, what is going to happen to health, right? And then at that point, we are switching away, even though we are reserving gender with the procurement rules, we are switching away from expenditure that is gender conscious. So many dimensions to be taken into account. Yeah, thank you so much. Very, very relevant, and I'm sure plenty of questions later on. Vinay, can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Vinay, can you hear me? Vinay, are you there? May I introduce you? Miriam, io aspetto notizie. I don't see anybody anymore.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Could you hear before? Could you hear before Anna Maria speaking?
Yeah, of course. I was able to hear everything.
Do you give me 2 seconds to introduce you?
Of course.
Thank you so much, Vinay. Delighted to have you here. Vinay Sharma joined the World Bank as a director on June 15, 2017. He has over 30 years of experience, much of which has been at senior leadership positions, responsible for policy formulation, project management, developing strategic alliances, and implementation of reforms. Before joining the World Bank, Vinay was the director of the African Development Bank Procurement and Fiduciary Services Department. He worked on procurement, financial management, anti-corruption at AFDB for 14 years, where he handled a wide range of broad public sector governance and management issues, including hands-on review of AFDB most complex and challenging procurement transactions. Vinay, we are so delighted and honored to have you here, and I leave you the floor and the slides. 20 minutes.
Thank you.
I'm going to let you know when minutes are missing.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Gustavo. Just wanted to know whether I should be controlling the slides, or will it be done by someone in the room?
You should be putting the slides.
Okay. So let me try and do that. Just give me a second.
Sure. Lo aiutiamo qualcuno? Andrea, lo aiuta qualcuno? Mi sa che... Is it easy? Is it easy, Vinay?
If it can be handled by you, I think it will be easier, because for some reason I'm finding it's slightly difficult to
Qualcuno lo deve aiutare.
to share the.
Ok. Per Ron? Non c'è bisogno della password per Ron. Non c'è bisogno della password per Ron. Pleasure.
While we waiting, there you go.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Che facciamo? Vinay?
Yes.
I think we're gonna move the slides ourselves. Hold on a second.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You do
All
have
right.
5
Thank you.
slides. You
Yes,
have
yes,
5
I can.
slides, right? Please
Yeah,
say
wonderful.
slide when you're done.
Okay, wonderful. Yes. So I've stopped my video just to conserve the bandwidth, because sometimes it does make a difference. So good morning and good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much, Professor Piga, for inviting me to this event. My thanks are also to Andrea, Valentina, Roberto, Miriam, and to Professor Ana La Chimia and Professor Steven Schooner, who are my fellow panelists. For those of you who are fasting, I extend Ramadan Kareem. I feel humbled today to be sharing the stage with Professor Chimia, Professor Schooner, Professor Gustavo Piga, who are in the forefront of the discussions on public procurement. I am also honored to be among the sapiens who have chosen procurement as a field of advanced study, and I congratulate them on their choice. While the topic of this session is very interesting, it has also significant complexities. This is an issue that is at the center stage of discussions on public procurement. A large part of the debate is on the what and the how of sustainable procurement. This is critical if the issue is to be mainstreamed, and we all agree that it requires to be mainstreamed in the discussions on more effective public financial management. It would help, however, if we are also to briefly understand why the subject is gaining prominence and what the role of various actors in the procurement ecosystems is. I hope that we'll be able to appreciate the complexities because the subject is multidimensional and that there are multiple layers that need to be understood. I am lucky that the panel includes Professor Lachimia and Professor Schooner, who have a far more impressive technical knowledge and body of work on this subject. My job is easy. I only have to confine myself to a general treatment on the subject. My apologies if there is a repetition of what you have already learned so far, and by its very nature, there would be overlaps with the presentation of Professor Lachimia, which I must admit was an excellent introduction to the subject. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, as you know, public procurement is big. Of the $100 of economic activity in the globe, $13 are spent through public procurement, and $13 at least are spent through public procurement. This is often more than 1/3 of the government's budget, and in many countries, it's even more than the tax revenues that the government collects. This volume can have significant impact on local businesses, on trade, on communities, on a variety of things. More effective public procurement policies and practices can help our countries move more easily to what we in the World Bank call green, inclusive, and resilient economies. So let us try and understand how this is possible. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, for the mirror slide.
So given its dollar spend, when we say $13 trillion, it is clear that it will be a pity if procurement remains a mechanical transactional tool. Procurement can help transform societies. And I think this is what Professor Chimia was saying earlier. It would be a pity if procurement is not used for transformation of societies. This is, for many, this appears to be a lofty aim, but it is possible. While much has been said in the past of the benefits through more efficient processes, through reduction in bureaucracy, for example, through use of technology, to increase productivity of procurement staff. And these benefits are huge. But this by itself cannot be transformational. It can help free fiscal space, but that would still be the tip of the iceberg. Public procurement is and should be recognized as a strategic tool for socioeconomic change that uses government purchasing decisions more strategically. Now, this means going beyond economic efficiency considerations that I had talked about a little earlier, and procurement should support broader policy goals such as environmental stewardship, resilient and inclusive economic development, and social protection. Now, governments have many ways to pursue social values in procurement. And one of those ways is the use of contracts to promote innovation or to strengthen key industries or sectors of the national economy. This requirement of the government and the economic ambitions of governments are different. So, Jordan would have economic aspirations that are different from Burkina Faso. We cannot therefore have the same set of prescriptive rules for socio-economic considerations for all countries. That would be to reduce this important subject to another set of mechanical activities. This will not increase value optimally. What does it mean? So let me try and try to unpack this a little bit and then get back to the basics. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, very often we understand that if you have better governance, the procurement activities are going to be done better, it's going to be more effective and so on. Now, so many people who sort of believe this, they argue that if systems and processes by which entities are directed and controlled for decision-making, for example, accountability, and more importantly, behavior, if they are improved, outcomes will be better. We know that this is true. The question is this enough? Is better governance the answer? There is a term that is used very often in public financial management, and it's a term that's been beaten to death, and this is value for money, or VFM. In the case of public procurement, VFM is the strategic imperative that connects procurement to other dimensions of national governance. Efficiency and economy are important components of this, of VFM. But the real value is achieved if the focus is also on meaningful upstream policy-focused work that provides differentiated guidance based on a country's own requirements or aspirations. So while doing while doing procurement more economically and efficiently is important, it is perhaps even more important that we start looking at the upstream part. Better governance is therefore a necessary condition for optimal procurement outcomes. It certainly is not the sufficient one. There is a fundamental difference between value and price. Price is what one pays, value is what one gets. In the case of procurement using public money, we'll need to understand the criticality of a country's socio-economic policy imperative. So a country can have joblessness as an issue. This country could have a lot of unemployed youth that are educated. The challenges are going to be different from another country that has a lot of youth that are unemployed but who are uneducated. This, we argue, should be the basis for value. We also know that there are a number of different international or regional players who have their own versions of an effective procurement framework. The World Bank has one, the African Development Bank has one, we have UNCITRAL tools, and so on and so forth. Now, many of these players are multilateral or bilateral donors or UN agencies. Now, typically, the donors tend to favor their frameworks and would like the country's procurement systems to largely mirror their own. And it has worked a great deal in the last many years, but is this the most approach for a country? Now, we argue that such an approach cannot be applied directly and mechanically in a country. And there is a very important reason. The procurement frameworks of donor organizations have been primarily geared to ensure that funds are used for their intended purposes. This does not necessarily mean that at macro levels to promoting national socioeconomic goals in ways that the client countries perceive as most effective. So this brings us to an interesting and a complex interplay between financiers and beneficiaries. Professor Piga, how much of time do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay.
10 minutes, Vinay.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. So now, financiers of development aid are obviously not the ultimate beneficiaries of client countries, and this is an extremely important point. I mean, the financiers of development are not the ultimate beneficiaries of client countries. The financiers, because the financiers are the taxpayers of the donor countries, while the beneficiaries are the citizens of countries that are receiving aid. The interests of the financiers, which is the the taxpayers of the donor countries, and the receivers or the beneficiaries, which is the taxpayers of the receiving countries, is not necessarily okay. Yeah, it is not necessarily aligned. So how do we so what happens? I mean, if a country is using its own resources, then the interests of the financiers, which are the taxpayers, and the beneficiaries, which is also the taxpayers, are aligned. The interest of and therefore that would be the policy implications of this scenario would be different from the policy implications of the earlier one. Now, if the best results of government expenditure are to be achieved in the most sustainable way, we need to calibrate the most robust metrics of policy measures from a country's own point of view. This will ensure that the implementation will yield optimal development effectiveness. And once this problem is resolved, then the implementation is going to be relatively straightforward. Once we have decided that this is the paradigm that we are going to use, then the implementation has certain challenges, but those challenges are very well understood. We have development of many tools in procurement using the above principles. We have life cycle costing, for example. We have weighting of non-price factors, the meat that Professor Chimia was talking about. And then building the capacity of the countries to be able to implement this would be important. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the next slide, please. Okay, while we wait for the next slide to load.
Hold on a second, we seem to have a problem in moving the slides. Hold on.
All right.
Here we go.
Okay, so so then when we talk about value for money, and I had mentioned this in passing, that value is not only economy and efficiency. So we probably need to define value for money in a way that we have a common definition across the board. And one of the suggestions that is being made, which has been made by many people in the past, is to express value for money in terms of pursuing economy. So we have, as you know, the VFM is considered to have the four dimensions: economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and these days we also talk about equity as an important component of value for money. So when we talk about economy, what is economy? It is a careful management of available resources. Efficiency, which is delivering the best level of output for less. Effectiveness is delivering the right service. And that the equity is essentially to make sure that people of different levels in the country get their fair share. Can we go to the next one? And that is another way of looking at things. That is the way that the MDBs, with the results framework, sort of tend to favor. And that is, economy assesses the degree to which inputs, the results framework sort of talks about inputs to outputs to outcomes to results and then to impact. So economy it assesses the degree to which inputs are being purchased in the right quality and the right quantity at the right price. So that is the input-based work. Efficiency is trying to convert these inputs into outputs, and it assesses how efficiently the project is delivering its outputs, considering the rate at which intervention inputs are converted to outputs and cost efficiency. Effectiveness is converting the outputs to outcomes, and it assesses the quality of the interventions work by assessing the rate at which outputs are converted into outcomes and impacts, and the cost effectiveness of this conversion. And finally, equity is the degree to which the results of the interventions are distributed in a fair manner. Now, can we go to the next one, please? And here what we'd like to say is that of the four E's, economy and efficiency I would argue, are more transactional in nature. Okay, so they depend, and these are things that are fairly easy to define. They are fairly easy to measure how well we are doing in terms of economy, how well we are doing in terms of efficiency. There are very relatively good ways of achieving them. Technology is a very important way of achieving efficiency, a greater efficiency and greater economy. It is the effectiveness and equity that becomes a little more difficult to define and a little more difficult to measure, because they depend on externalities. And externalities can be positive, they can be negative. So if you are buying something that is going to damage the environment, it is a negative externality. If you're doing something that is going to be better for society, it's a positive externality. So the economy and efficiency have a predominantly transactional focus, and effectiveness and equity are more dependent on more externalities, and therefore would require a greater deal of a more rigorous way of treatment, because a direct mechanical way of measurement may not be directly possible. Can we go to the next one? In the interest of time, I'll not talk very much about this. This is essentially the a pictorial representation of what I just said. Through the policy objective, through the tools, we come to policy fulfillment, and then we go from inputs to outputs to outcomes to impact, and then try to achieve things, and then go back if there are gaps that are being that need to be filled up. So can we go to the next one, please? Now, this is the new paradigm, and I must thank Professor Chimia, because she explained this so very well. Now, there has been a move to a new paradigm in procurement. As I mentioned earlier, procurement is nothing if you are not able to realize the national, or it is not connected to the socio-economic and environmental goals of the country. And these are the so-called collateral objectives. I mean, earlier people used to call them secondary objectives, but I think Professor Piga, Professor Trepte have taken a huge exception to this, and they are now called, sometimes the Professor Piga believes that they should be the primary goals, but we at least should call them the transnational or collateral objectives. So let's take a few examples. Creating a resilient and inclusive economy depends on diversifying production, both in terms of what is produced and who is producing it. Now, public procurement can be a very important policy instrument for encouraging key sectors of the national economy through sometimes local content approaches, or some ways to encourage the participation of MSMEs, gender issues, those people who have been disadvantaged in societies, and so on. Social considerations also relate to broadly two areas of public procurement, which is protection of labor and human rights, and the support for disadvantaged groups. Very often these are treated through conditions in the contracts. Labor and human rights, for example, you would have seen the core labor conditions of the ILO that are included in most of the FIDIC contracts today. They include forced labor. They include clauses on to prevent child of forced labor, excessive working hours, low wages, lack of freedom of association, human trafficking, unsafe working conditions, unfair labor management practices, etc. Sometimes disadvantaged groups is done through laws, which the public procurement laws sort of refer to, so that the public procurement activities do not leave behind vulnerable entrepreneurs or workers whose disadvantages derive from factors such as disability, race, gender, social status, etc. Now, many economists feel that integration of these objectives in public procurement policy contrasts with the goal of economic efficiency, and they may result in the award of tenders with more limited participation and ostensibly at higher prices. Now, many countries believe that an extra initial payment for better results subsequently may not be the best idea, particularly in areas of budget scarcity. But I think it is important that this issue be disabused, or this notion be disabused, because over a period of time, if these considerations are taken at the optimal level, then the economy is going to benefit rather than be harmed as a result of this. There are many others who believe that procurement is not the right tool for this, and that supply side initiative should be more effective. For example, building capacity of the entrepreneurs, access to easier credit, for example. These they believe are more effective tools to achieve these socioeconomic objectives. I think the jury is out. There are many people on both sides of the fence who believe that who believe one issue over the other. Can we go to the next slide, please? Because I think I'm coming to the end of my my presentation. So yeah, so I would like to, yes. So do we, when these are very complex issues. These are issues that are multidimensional, multi-layered and so on. And one of the questions that we have been asking ourselves is, do we need a global coalition to discuss these issues? Now, a new World Bank report, which is called an International Stocktaking of Developments and Public Procurement, which has as one of the co-authors, Professor Piga himself, it offers a way forward. It shows how the current hodgepodge of procurement practices with few common rules could be replaced by an efficient global system that better serves the public needs. But this will require a broad international coalition, including governments as well as private businesses, academics, NGOs, and so on and so forth. And it will be only then that the full potential of public procurement will be achieved and the global economy set on a yeah. So it is the name. The title is an international stocktaking of developments in public procurement. And there is a link in this the presentation. If you click on that link, then you'd be able to go directly to the presentation. I mean, a large number of copies have already been downloaded. Now, the World Bank is proposing the creation of a global procurement partnership for just that purpose. And the overarching goal will be to establish a global network to promote the strategic use of public procurement as a critical economic planning and development tool. It will collect best practices from around the world to strengthen knowledge sharing and collaboration. And a network like the one that you are a member of, I would assume, would be an important component of the partnership. Now, I would say that it is a timely proposal. It can help ensure that national procurement policies are evidence-based and resistant to political influence and privilege, because there would be a network of through rigorous work that would be working together. We hope that it can spark innovation in crucial areas by encouraging tighter collaboration between governments and private enterprises, linking the academics with the practitioners, and it can help improve public trust by increasing citizen empowerment and engagement. So in the aftermath of, and this is the end of my my presentation, the aftermath of the COVID-19, governments will be under pressure to make sure that every dollar of expenditure goes as far as it possibly can. And citizens are well within their rights to demand that the money be spent as wisely as possible. Now, smart public procurement is central to a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery from the pandemic. Governments, private enterprises, and development institutions should do everything in their power to seize the trillions of dollars of opportunity that this represents. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Vinay, thank you so much. There's so much at stake here in your presentation. I take the word new paradigm and I put it together with the question that we have posed to you, reconciling social and green issues around the globe. And the answer is indeed a new paradigm that comes from global institutions, in the sense that what we heard from you is that the concept of value for money is a concept that should be based on what you call the imperatives on social economic policy of the given country. And so, just like with Anna Maria, we're back to throw the ball, not on the court of the procurers, but on the courts, quote unquote, of the politicians and of the national aspirations of democratic countries. Certainly the last slide reminds us, however, that there's a role for a global coalition to support, obviously, those national enterprises of populations and democracies. I think these two presentations that we've heard are quite refreshing and revolutionary in the language itself that we are used to listen to, very much focused a lot of time on what you called optimal governance, which is certainly, we all agree, a necessary condition, but possibly not sufficient. So thank you so much for enlightening us on this matter. Steve, Professor Schooner from George Washington University. Yes, I see the slides ready. Let me just briefly introduce you, Steve. Before joining the law school faculty in 1988 of JWU, Professor Schooner was the Associate Administrator for Procurement Law and Legislation at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy in the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. He previously served as a trial and appellate attorney in the commercial litigation branch of the Department of Justice, and he also practiced with private law firms. And as an active duty Army judge advocate, he served as a commissioner at the Armed Service Board of Contract Appeals. Till his retirement as an Army Reserve officer, he was an adjunct professor in the Contract and Fiscal Law Department of the Judge Advocate General Schools of the Army in Charlottesville, Virginia. And that's very, very brief summary of a fantastically long CV. Steve, again, we are delighted to have you here. Thank you for finding time for our PhD students. And I leave you the floor. I hope you can manage the slides on your own. Thank you.
Okay.
20 minutes.
So first, let me say I wish I was there, and I look forward to returning to Tor Vergata in July. It's been a long time. It's a beautiful setting. I'm finding it very difficult to appreciate any of the food that you are serving today. But for our purposes today, I want to applaud the students, the researchers, on their efforts. In the United States, I feel like I'm trying to recruit a coalition of the willing. And so it's gratifying to see what's happening in the EU, particularly with regard to the SAPIENS program. And I wish we had something more like that in the United States. For my purposes today, I'm going to limit my approach or discussion to the issue of climate change, consistent with Gustavo's introduction about the recent IPCC report. And I'm pleased that you have access to some of the writings that I've published in the last couple of years on this. But today I want to focus exclusively on performance measurement and why it matters. It's wonderful to be able to follow Vinay and Anna, and I think that to some extent I'm going to build on their themes, particularly some of the things that Vinay spoke about, and to some extent what I'm going to do is a little bit more mundane. But for the researchers, my goal today is to help at least a little bit with structuring your research, and more than anything else, to emphasize my generation's failure in how we designed public procurement systems, and basically to encourage you to do better. So against that backdrop, let me try to put some of this in context. If you don't remember anything else from what I talk about today, my primary point to you comes from the management concept that what gets measured gets managed. And because everything that we're trying to do with sustainable procurement requires some amount of change management, we need to think about changing behavior. And one of the ways that we change behavior is by letting the public and the public procurement profession know that we are assessing their performance differently. We are going to count and record and publish different metrics. And my aspiration here, if we ever hope to achieve anything in public procurement, we need to focus more on outcomes and less on process. So let me begin, and I don't want to spend too much time with this, but for the researchers who think this is absolutely obvious and may think I am insane for making this simple point, let me try to emphasize to you that to my generation, this is revolutionary. Sadly, when you look at Gustavo's absence of hair and my gray hair, what you need to appreciate is the public procurement systems that we grew up with were designed to be objective, and transparent and focused predominantly on low prices because they were easy to understand, they were easy to keep track of, and they were easy to compare. I refer to this in my writing as the tyranny of low price, and it represents everything that is wrong with public procurement today and much of the challenge that you face. Now, to some extent, and I know that many of you are familiar with the Open Contracting Data Partnership, to many extent, they are subject to this tyranny and need to reimagine what procurement means in this regard. But again, let me just try to stay focused on the idea that everything about the way the procurement systems have been designed, not for 20 years, not for 40 years, but for generations, has been on transparency, objectively following rules, or what we call process. It is heartbreaking to me that generations of public procurement officials, experts, specialists, studied and learned procurement in a world that was defined by following the rules. We didn't talk about the customer. We didn't talk about the outcome. And so if you don't remember anything else that I say today, I want to come down to this basic, simple point. And that is, Vinay mentioned value, but we need to distinguish low prices from value. As you know, when you spend your own money, a low price does not represent value. I can follow all of the rules and I can get a lower price than anybody else. But if what I buy doesn't work, doesn't meet my needs, doesn't fit, doesn't make me happy, and doesn't permit my government to serve the public, it wasn't a bargain. It's a false economy. Fascinatingly enough, most public procurement systems were designed without even using the words customer satisfaction, which is the coin of the realm in the private sector. You know, when you spend your money, all you care about is, did I think I got value for my money? Does it make me happy? Does it meet my needs? But that's not the way we designed our procurement systems. Now, in the last 20 to 30 years, we have talked about value for money, best value. The European Union embraced most economically advantageous tender, and now the UK has modified the term a little bit. We talk about the cost technical trade-off. The World Bank embraced the price quality ratio, and we at least talk more about quality, utility, and customer satisfaction. But it's not the way we designed our systems. You heard Vinay mention the concept of life cycle cost. And I think that in your research, what you're increasingly going to find is that the global best practice with regard to public procurement is you need to think in terms of life cycle cost analysis. Marta has done some wonderful work on this. Many of the SAPIENS colleagues have published in this in terms of group research, but interestingly enough, it has not yet broken through. So my takeaway for you today is avoid the tyranny of low prices, focus on value for money, and the best representational tool as we change the way we think about measurement is life cycle cost. Now, let me put this in a slightly more concrete perspective. The United States has more public procurement data than any country in the history of the world. We have been collecting procurement data, not for decades, but for generations. I want you to know unequivocally that our data is garbage. We have spent generations measuring what is easy to measure and not what's important. So in the middle column, we have what I say a massive database. I mean a massive database. What do we have data on? We know how many transactions, how much money we spent, what we paid, whether the price was low or not low. We know whether contractors delivered on time. We know whether they met the specifications in their contract or did what they promised to do. And we know very, very specifically who got those contracts. Large businesses, small businesses. We know what state the money was spent in. We know what legislative district, or in other words, we know how much money is spent in each member of Congress's jurisdiction. We have all of this data. And I say to you today that in terms of what matters in public procurement, it's useless. If you were spending your own money, what do you want to know? Did we get value for money? Did it work? Did it meet our needs? Did it last? Did it make the customer happy? We have no data on that, none whatsoever. So if we buy something and the contractor delivers on time and the price is good and it goes to a warehouse and it's never used, we consider that a successful procurement. That's insane. It makes no sense at all. And we need to fundamentally rethink this, particularly if we're going to address climate change and do all of the things that we need to do with regard to green or environmentally friendly procurement. So here's my research takeaway for you today. Life cycle cost. In any introductory economics class, they would teach this. And what's remarkable to me is how many public procurement officials don't know anything about it. A topic for another day is too many public procurement professionals are experts in governance and bureaucracy and don't know anything about the private sector and don't understand economics. But let's put that aside for a second. All right, why life cycle cost? Life cycle cost, unlike purchase price, focuses on the value proposition. So first and foremost, life cycle cost does include the purchase price. So it is relevant, okay? That's important. Number two, it includes our transaction costs. Everything that we do in procurement is overhead to some extent, but we need to count that. And it's one of the reasons why in most countries around the world, we've spent the last 20 to 25 years focusing on electronic commerce portals and framework agreements. Those tools drive down transaction costs. But if we don't take into account our transaction costs, we're not being honest about what we spend. Okay, purchase price, transaction costs. The two big ones that most people think about in public procurement are operating costs and maintenance costs. Just think about an automobile you may purchase. If you buy a big, expensive, comfortable, safe automobile, you will spend more on oil, gas, and petrol. If you purchase a smaller, lighter, more inexpensive vehicle, you'll probably get more miles or more kilometers to the gallon. Now, of course, we can also think about this in terms of hybrid automobiles and electric vehicles. You pay more in purchase price for a hybrid or an electric vehicle, but your operating costs come down because you're not buying fuel or petrol. All right, that's pretty easy. All right, maintenance or sustainment costs is also very relevant for any procurement because if it doesn't work, you're not getting value. And the more money you spend fixing it, the higher your costs are for using it. And if you have an automobile and it is frequently being fixed or in the mechanic shop, you probably have to spend money on alternative transportation. And those alternatives are part of your maintenance or sustainment costs. Finally, there's disposition costs. At the end of the useful life or at the end of your ownership of what you've purchased, you have to get rid of it. Now, if you bought an inexpensive automobile and you drove it until it didn't work anymore, it probably doesn't cost you very much to get rid of it. But if you bought an expensive automobile, a Mercedes-Benz or a Lexus or something very, very nice, Peugeot, and you drove it for 5 years and took good care of it, you will probably resell that automobile. Your disposition cost becomes negative, and the total amount that you spent in life cycle costs is dramatically reduced. Let me give you a quick alternative at the opposite end of the spectrum. In the United States, when we buy a nuclear submarine, it costs over $1 billion. They often operate for 30 or 40 years or more. But at the end of the useful life, it costs more to decommission or disassemble the nuclear submarine than it costs to build it. So don't tell me that a nuclear submarine costs $1 billion if you don't include the $1 billion you're going to spend when you're done with it. So we do need to think about disposition costs. In addition, there's a time value of money and present value issue here, a little bit more complicated, because sometimes you pay up front, sometimes you pay over time, and this could matter with regard to leasing and purchasing. But you heard Vinay use the word externalities or effects, and this is where climate change comes into play. Historically, when we have focused obsessively on low purchase prices, we have ignored the externalities or the effects of our purchasing decisions. If you go out to purchase a new automobile today, the least expensive automobile will be the fossil fuel burning automobile. That low purchase price does not reflect the emissions which are warming the planet. It does not reflect the pollution which drives up your country's healthcare costs in the short term and the long term. And historically, we have ignored externalities and effects in all of our procurement decisions. We need to change that. And the challenge in public procurement is in our evaluation criteria and in the way that we structure our specifications, and thus in the way we do our market research and our acquisition planning. We need to fundamentally ask the question, if I am willing to pay a higher purchase price, what benefits as a government, a society, and a planet do I receive? Or in other words, how much more do I have to pay to avoid purchasing the harmful solution, which is less expensive? And this is fundamentally our challenge. Now, it's very easy for me to say, and we can talk more about this later, but if you've been following what we've done in the United States, my postal service is in the process of buying over 100,000 new, inefficient, fossil fuel burning mail delivery trucks because they're less expensive. This is actually extremely controversial in the United States, but the Postal Service is saying we can't afford to buy hybrids or electric vehicles. My response is, as a nation, as a government, as a society, we can't afford not to pay the price premium to buy electric vehicles or hybrids so that our children and our children's children can enjoy the quality of life that we enjoyed. So, turning to my last slide, as much as I want you to focus on rethinking performance measurement and remembering that what gets measured gets managed, just remember, in procurement, it's all about people. Over the last 40 years, as we've watched the global public procurement community come together, harmonize, share ideas, and share best practices, one thing that we learned is it's incredibly easy to write procurement laws. It's incredibly easy to write procurement regulations and promulgate policy. But changing behavior is difficult, and procurement is all about people. When you award a contract, you form a relationship. Relationships must be based on trust, and they must be managed. And as I like to remind Americans and government officials around the world, we spend all of our time thinking about how we choose our contractors, and then we don't manage our contracts. Let me be unequivocally clear that if you spend your entire life preparing for your wedding day and declaring victory at the end of your wedding celebration, you are in for a massive disappointment. A marriage is difficult. It's all about compromise, working together to get shared value from the relationship. And that's hard work. But we don't spend enough time thinking about contract management. We focus so much on the process that we lose sight of what we're trying to do. So let's think about fundamentally changing the conversation. Let's rethink what we mean when we say value, and let's hope that your generation can do a little bit better than ours. And now against that backdrop, I want to see if I can figure out how I can stop sharing my screen. And I'm not quite sure how to do that. Any ideas, folks?
Thank you so much, Steve.
I can't turn my screen share off. Oh, wait, I got it. I think I got it. No, I got it.
Thank you so much. And the first slide set the tone, outcomes versus processes. I was reminded of Anna Maria's focus on reminding us how negative it would be to imagine sustainability in terms of a tick box approach. And I think we had some relevant parallels here. It's extremely important, the availability of data. Thinking of the best practices you were mentioning, Korea, which looks into measuring the greenhouse gas reductions that come with public procurement every year, and the number of what they call green economy related jobs that get created. And absolutely, I think you have set the complementary part of the two speeches, so that now our PhD students, there we go, thank you for saving time. You were part of the procurement process here. Thank you for giving us.
Could I speak briefly to the question from Eveline?
The question from?
I see a question or a comment in the chat from Eveline. Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, one of the questions, my audio is no good. Is my audio okay, Gustavo?
Steve, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see the question on the chat. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So the question that we often have is, if we don't have consistent metrics for some kind of a sustainability assessment, or in other words, if I can't compare apples to oranges, it makes life difficult. I believe the growing best practice is to appreciate the fact that the private sector probably has better information on the environmental harms and benefits of their work than the governments do. So I think the most important thing to begin with is, do not assume that public procurement officials have the information to do the comparison. The challenge is to ask private sector vendors about their products and their supply chain. If you look at some of the materials that I published, you'll see that in the United States, our Environmental Protection Agency has a tool for measuring scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions: direct, indirect, and supply chain emissions. If you're interested in this topic, what I encourage you to look at is the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is an independent organization that basically assesses the environmental status of individual firms. And the beauty of the SBTI is that firms participate voluntarily and then go through a screening process. So there are numerous different standards organizations. It depends on the type of industries they're in. But again, this is not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yes, very quickly on the issue of externalities and how to look at goods and services and what impact they can have on gender equality. It's, just to get back to what I was saying at the beginning, I think that there are significant impact on the way services especially are provided. And these need to be considered. And I mean, I guess from the point of view of gender equality, it's quite straightforward to do, because we are focusing on one element as opposed to, when we think of sustainability of all the three issues that we want to consider. But But with gender, it's very straightforward because we can look at who are the beneficiaries of a service and or who is employed in a sector, in the same way for goods by looking at the production process. So in a way, you know, the network, the fact that it looks at supply chains, that becomes very important because, you know, you need to make the assessment throughout the supply chain to discover where the weaknesses and where the strengths are and what the impact is. So just wanted to add this in terms of the externalities for gender equality.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now, I mean, obviously, for those PhDs of you who are on online, you can use the chat. We're going to take a closer look. I'm going to take a closer look. But the microphone should be here, right, Andrea? Okay, so I asked PhDs to speak and to our speakers and introduce themselves when they speak. I think I see one here, Andrea, thank you so much, but they can pass it around. The questions are a little bit brief and the answers also to the point. Thank you.
Of course, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I have a question for Professor Chimia. It's very nice to meet you in person, and I wanted to refer to your presentation and be more specific about, also linked to what Professor Schooner mentioned before. What are the most efficient mitigation strategies against social washing, as it happens in the greenwashing procurement? If you can share with us from your experience.
Thank you so much for this question, because I think it's one of the most important ones. You know, if you think about tokenism, tokenism means ownership of companies. I think that by looking just at CEO and the composition of women's-owned companies, it's not enough. What if you have a woman in the board or two women in the board but make absolutely no decision and their voice doesn't count? For me, it would be more important to look at the policies that the company implements in terms of seeing what career progression there are for women, what support exists in terms of care leave, do they have provision of nurseries within the companies. So this would be the type of measure that I would see as being more important rather than just thinking of numerical outcomes. But of course, you know, we would need to go really one by one and looking at what various measures within the procurement process can be taken. And this, of course, cannot be done so quickly. You know, we would need to take really a long time. But I think this is important, you know, thinking how not to just pink wash our procurement process. And there was something else I wanted to tell you about the pink washing and the announcement of women, but now I forgot. So
when it comes back,
Maybe.
When you come back, so you say.
Yeah.
There was another question, I think, here. Thank you.
Hi, I am also.
Can you say your name, please?
Yes, my name is Vergata. I am with Prof University of Budapest, and I am researching on gender issues in procurement. Your presentation was very focused on male and female distinction. Now, the issue that I, in general, have faced is non-inclusion of other genders, since we know that it's more representative now. So how do you think we can represent other genders also in this procurement issue?
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very important issue. And actually, one of the limitations that we have highlighted straight away in the report for the World Bank is that the notion of gender is, of course, non-binary. I'm sorry if I distinguished only between male and female. It's easier sometimes just to refer to women as opposed to, you know, having a broader concept of gender. It's just a matter of practice. That's why I was saying even the language that is using gendering is important. And by no means, you know, we need to be very aware of this. There are absolutely no data on this issue. There is very little work done. And all we could find when we did our desk review and when we did the interview is a proposal by Argentina that they aim to give trans rights and trans preferences we need to include trans rights and trans preferences within the procurement process, which I think is something quite innovative that we haven't seen anywhere. But again, I think from that point of view, it's really the issue that I was telling you at the beginning of looking at the country and knowing the situation of the country is incredibly important. A student of mine this year did a PhD thesis, not a PhD, an LLM thesis on trans rights in the workplace in Italy and the barriers that non-binary people suffer in the workplace are immense, from the gender identification, from even the possibility to work or how to be addressed, so the rights that they can have are immense, are significant. So that is where it's really important to understand the country and see what the barriers are. Sadly, we're very far from any meaningful discourse on this, but the question is important, and we are here to do research. You are here to do research and to change and challenge the reality. So thank you for thinking about this issue, and I will give you the reference of the Argentinian law because I have it.
May I just ask, do people online hear the questions when the PhD students ask them with the microphone or not? It seems to me that you cannot hear. Can they hear? Otherwise, they come here to ask questions. Questions from the floor. PhD students here? More questions? Yes, please come here just to make sure. I don't know about the microphone. Hold on a second. We're having. Please also say your name.
Good afternoon. My name is Chiara. I'm working on sustainable public food procurement, and I have a question for Professor Schooner. I'm also very thankful for the presentation. All the three presentations were amazing. And so my question is about life cycle costing methodology. And I was wondering how do we weigh the different elements within the evaluation, because for example, thinking about the climate crisis and the tipping points that are related to it, that are threatening all forms of life, both human and natural on Earth. How do we consider that all these tipping points and the time that is running out is affecting these?
I'm going to apologize just for a second. So don't worry about looking at the screen. I heard that you wanted to ask about life cycle costs, but just get very close to the microphone and please speak more slowly. Don't worry about the screen. Don't look. Get closer to the mic. Closer.
Okay.
Closer to the microphone, please.
Closer.
Close.
Too close. Too
No,
close.
get closer, please. Closer.
Okay, so how do we consider that actually related to the climate crisis, we have some tipping points and also the time that is running out, and we are actually maybe we can miss some targets are already beyond the reach. So how do we consider this in the evaluation of the life cycle? Do we have a way to move also this evaluation according to these different trends that we have?
So, with apologies if I didn't understand the question, what I heard was, as the current IPCC report makes very clear, we're behind. The crisis is significant. It's getting worse. Every promise that every country has made has basically been broken. We're not going to meet the targets, and therefore, all of our concerns with regard to both adaptation to and mitigation of climate change become more acute every day. I think what the real answer to your question is procurement can't fix this alone. And I think that you heard some of this from the other speakers. But what we really need is clear messaging from senior leadership. We need government officials, we need the private sector, we need the public to basically say, We have to stop being penny wise and pound foolish. It is easy to say that we cannot afford to do the right things, but we now must understand that we cannot afford to do the right thing. And whatever we think we're doing with saving money, all we're doing is buying bigger problems later. But I can assure you that in my country and in your country, and this is true at the World Bank as well, most public procurement officials do not believe that they have unlimited budgets. You heard Vinay talk about limited resources. We need senior government officials and powerful people to say, we have to make investments now. We have to change behavior. We're going to have to suffer if we don't want to make the world unlivable for our children and their grandchildren. And I do not see that yet. I'll stop with a very simple example. Since this election, forget the last 5 years in the United States, the retrograde president who withdrew from Paris is harmful but not relevant. The new president basically said, climate is important. But if the president says climate is important, but the Postal Service buys 100,000 fossil fuel vehicles, then the bottom line is it's just empty talk. We have to talk the talk, but we also have to walk the walk.
Yes, please come here. Let me just add, Steve, that was a lot of reaction from scientists appalled after the Russian crisis at how we reacted in terms of the energy shift without even thinking 1 minute. So what you're mentioning is extremely important. Yeah, please do come.
And as we know, war is not particularly good for the environment either.
Thank you very much for your presentations to all of you. I wanted to make a question to Professor Steve Schooner. I'm Federica, and I'm a master's PhD fellow. And my question is, you mentioned, Professor, that in America you are, in the United States, you are collecting a lot of data in public procurement, but I was wondering if this goes hand in hand with the, at least in some federal states, with quantifications of these emissions during procurement procedures. And if you can make some examples, if there are federal states or municipalities that are actually quantifying these emissions.
So,
thank you.
I apologize if I didn't fully get the question, but what I think I heard was, we have all this data in the United States. Do we have data correlating what we do in public procurement with the environmental objectives that I'm talking about? And I think the short answer is no. We are very behind on this. We still continue to do the same stupid things we've been doing for 70 years. And then in addition to that, one of the challenges with life cycle cost is we need good data sets. But if we don't structure our procurements to focus on value, and we don't change the way we think, we don't do the measurement. I will say in the United States, we are seeing again that the private sector is far ahead of the government on these issues. We have some excellent data sets coming out of our Environmental Protection Agency with regard to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but they are not correlated to public procurement outcomes.
Steve, I think Federica was also asking if you were aware of any best practice at the local/state level in terms of collection of data.
In the United States, I believe that the best examples we're seeing are coming out of Massachusetts. And in addition, if you are unfamiliar with it, and I'll drop a link in just a moment, Arizona State University has a Sustainable Procurement Research Center, and they're collecting some wonderful data, and they're publishing it as fast as they can. And I'll put that in the chat in just one moment.
Thank you so much.
Just wanted to add to Federica's question that the United Nations Environment Program launched the One Planet program this year, who gathers data on public procurement and climate change. So it's in our Dropbox folder.
Yes, please do come. By the way, I also encourage you to get coffees in the process because we are not going to start later on the coffee break.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
Thank you, all you three for your presentations. I am Laura Trevino. I am doing human rights integration into sustainable public procurement at University of Greenwich. And human rights, it's two words I didn't hear in any of the presentations. So I wonder whether how could we reconcile human rights into the sustainable discourse and into the social dimension of the sustainable public procurement?
Vinay, can I ask you to come in on this? Cannot hear you. Yeah, can you unmute Vinay, please? You heard the question, Vinay? You can talk, I think, now.
No, I can't. Oh, okay.
We can hear you. We can hear you now.
Okay.
You heard the question, or you want to rephrase it?
No, I heard the question. So, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important question. And in these presentations, of course, the entire spectrum of socioeconomic changes were not discussed, were not included. But human rights, inclusion of human rights, is an important part of this socioeconomic work in public procurement. There are so many issues that have to be included for making it much more comprehensive. We didn't talk about the social contract, for example, but social contract is incredibly important when we are talking about this subject.
Thank you so much.
Just to add on this, that women's rights are human rights. And so, and the environment is now more and more recognized as a right to the environment. So we are already talking about human rights. But what it changes is when you have a human rights approach, you move from charity to obligation, from, oh, I would like to have sustainable procurement because it's fancy, to I have to because it's an obligation of the state. Yeah, so I think this is the difference. And it's also about the difference in the process of the actors that are involved and of how those actors participate within the procurement process. So NGOs and anyone who has got an interest, associations, suppliers, women's group, then they would have to be involved in the process. So this is how I think, this is how the shift is made.
I think we're out of we are out of our times. Are there any other questions? Because I think we've done our 30 minutes. Is there anything written in the chat? Steve had responded. Thank you, Steve. I see somebody, Magdalena, would you like to speak? You appear. No, all of a sudden I saw Magdalena. Okay, so I would like to thank you all at this point. I think it was extremely interesting roundtable. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Vinay. We miss you very much over here. We can't wait to see you in Rome as soon as possible. Should be jealous of Anna Maria, who's here. And we'll see you soon.
Well, hopefully, if I can just add, hopefully we will see both Vinay and Professor Schooner in Nottingham at our conference, where Professor Piga will be our keynote panelist.
We will be joined. Fantastic. Ciao, guys.